The paper I'm going to talk about deals with the fall of the House of Usher, and in particularly the papers that I looked at talked about how Poe used a recipe for sublime terror in his Fall of the House of Usher. And this is a presentation for English Studies in Digital Environment. The presentation is organized in this way, so first I'll provide an introduction. Then I'll provide a little more in-depth overview of one of the papers that I reviewed, John H. Timmerman's paper, The House of Mirrors, Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. I didn't feel that paper provided all the context that I needed, so I looked at a complementary paper by Jonathan A. Cook entitled Poe and the Apocalyptic Sublime, The Fall of the House of Usher. And then I combined some of the concepts in Timmerman and Cook's paper to better understand from a structuralism point of view. And then I'll conclude. So my thesis for the paper that I wrote that goes along with this presentation is writing fiction involves more than just a few mental fact associations within the writer's mind. And in Edgar Allan Poe's perspective, The Fall of the House of Usher, Poe's cultural and literary time period provides a rich tapestry that converges in his classic Gothic horror. Now, before I go into the analysis of the papers, first I want to talk about literary criticism first. So Janet E. Gardner explains in Reading and Writing About Literature, this is our textbook for the class, structuralism is, to a literary critic, is about paying attention to the context of literature and gaining an understanding of all aspects of an author's and a reader's culture, such as the organizing structures of history, politics, religion, education, work, and family. And I put in bold history and religion because the papers that I'm looking at focus on those two aspects, history and religion. So let's talk a little bit about the time period that when Poe wrote The Fall of the House of Usher. So Poe was born in 1809 and died in 1849. So he actually lived kind of somewhat between the Enlightenment and the Romanticism movement in the United States. And I say Romanticism in the United States because Poe was an American and perhaps the European Romanticism was a little bit before that. So I wondered what these, living between these two time periods, how that influenced Poe's thinking in the creation of his stories, such as The Fall of the House of Usher. And so the two papers that I'm looking at are basically taking a structuralism approach. So first of all, we look at John H. Timmerman's paper. It's entitled The House of Mirrors, Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. And for this, the reason he's calling it The House of Mirrors is because he's looking for unity, for balance elements in Poe's fiction. And so he is looking at how perhaps Poe is trying to balance Enlightenment versus Romanticism, and he looks for different characters or different ways that he's trying to balance that. And he concludes his paper that, or Timmerman concludes his paper by saying that The Fall of House of Usher is a cautionary tale warning of a way Poe would not have artists go. And I think he primarily thinks of romantic or Romanticism authors, when reason, symbolized by Madeline Usher, and creativity, symbolized by Roderick Usher, become unbalanced. So after Timmerman goes through his analysis, he believes that Poe felt strongly enough that he should put symbolic characters in his stories, where it's showing Enlightenment characters versus Romanticism characters, where things are not really balanced. And so the main points of Timmerman's paper are that one thing is that he's looking again at Enlightenment versus Romanticism, and he's also looking at Poe's cosmology, or kind of Poe's religious views. So as I mentioned previously, Poe was looking to seek balance in his work, and in particular he was using the characters Madeline and Roderick as symbolic characters to show balance between Enlightenment and Romanticism. Poe also, Timmerman also says that Poe believed in Aristotle's prime mover, and I spelled prime incorrectly on this slide, but he's looking for the prime mover, and the prime mover in this case is just a god who kind of sets up the world and then just sort of walks away. This is kind of like the deism of kind of the founding fathers. Then Timmerman also asserts that this led to Poe's, through Poe's cosmology, led him to develop the poetic principle. And through that poetic principle, he says the death of a beautiful woman is both sad and beautiful, and providing us with an understanding of why Madeline Usher appears to die in the story. But really I think what he's meaning here is that Poe's using something that's kind of sad to elicit emotions in the part of the reader. So I think that's where he's getting at, that this is beautiful. The other thing that Timmerman asserts is that he also combines these concepts, Enlightenment and Romanticism, with Poe's cosmology, and he says that Poe was looking to provide unity or symbols of unity in his paper. So symbols of unity, or as Timmerman's calling them, kind of mirrors or mirror images of each other, is the family line with the house itself, unity of the family through inbreeding, and a brother-sister pair. So these kind of symbolisms, they kind of make sense. But here are some of the unsatisfying portions of Timmerman's work. So Madeline Usher, she doesn't appear in the story very much. So at the beginning of The Fall of the House of Usher, she is kind of just walks through, and she's almost as a ghost or something like that as she walks through. And then at the end, she kind of appears as a monster or something like that. But the appearances are very brief. So the narrator actually spends a good deal of time with Roderick Usher as he, plays music, he creates art, he reads literature, all these kind of things. So you can kind of see the argument that he may represent Romanticism, but the fact that Madeline Usher doesn't appear hardly in the story at all, you don't see any aspects of her analytical thinking or rationalistic views or any of this kind of stuff. So that part was unsatisfactory because I just didn't see that in the character. So I just wondered at this point, as I was reading that paper, whether there were any other aspects that we could bring into play. So then I found Jonathan A. Cook's paper, and so in that paper he says that Poe had a detailed knowledge of Edmund Burke's A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. And this inquiry provides the intellectual framework for eliciting emotions from the reader in works of fiction. And the creation of inquiry by Burke was influenced in turn by Enlightenment thinkers such as Locke, Hartley, and Hume. So this kind of made sense to me. And so what were the influences on Poe then? So as I mentioned before, Poe would use this as an intellectual framework of inquiry to create a sense of sublime horror. So basically he's creating emotions in the part of the reader, and so sometimes the emotions can be positive, as Timmerman was talking about, but in this case with this Gothic horror, he's trying to create terror emotions in the part of the reader. And in order to do that, using some of these ideas from inquiry, he is borrowing from other Gothic writers, such as Walpole, Ratcliffe, Lewis, and Hoffman. And the Gothic motifs include a haunted castle, medieval decor, a family curse, symbolic doubling, morally challenged hero-villain, a physically entrapped maiden, a self-consciously naive narrator, and a deeply buried secret exposed at the climax of the story. So I think The Fall of the House of Usher basically has all these elements, and I actually put in bold two elements that actually match what Timmerman was saying, the symbolic doubling and the physically entrapped maiden. And then Cook also goes on to say that Poe not only borrowed from other Gothic writers, but he actually borrowed from the Bible and made allusions to the Bible. And so examples of that were the final extermination of both the house and a genealogical line of the Ushers evokes the day of wrath imagined by the Old Testament prophets and enacted in the book of Revelation. And Roderick Usher and his sister ironically invert the traditional apocalyptic marriage of Christ and his church at the end of the Revelation, for it's the final marriage that precipitates the collapse of the doomed house. So this kind of analysis makes a little more sense, but I think it also adds to Timmerman's ideas. The other idea that occurred to me, simply because I had visited the Smithsonian Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. A couple years ago, on display there was Thomas Jefferson's Bible, and it was kind of amazing to see. It had big parts of the Bible actually cut out with a sharp knife, and these were the parts of the Bible that Jefferson thought were supernatural in origin, and so he distilled the New Testament down just to Jesus's kind of sayings or kind of concepts. And I wondered if when I was reading these papers, that if the Enlightenment impacted Jefferson to kind of do this, might these same type of influences have impacted Poe when he was crafting his stories, kind of making because of his exposure to rationalistic thinking and this idea of the prime mover as a god, could he actually cut through a lot of the religious thinking or whatever of the day? So what I was thinking then is the result of Enlightenment on Poe would be that he would see these Gothic elements of biblical allusions as something the reader is culturally conditioned to fear. And he kind of would get this idea from inquiry, that inquiry kind of says that we're kind of biological machines, that our brains are kind of conditioned to see things based on what our exposure to our culture. He also, I think, because he believes in this prime mover and not necessarily Yahweh of the Old Testament or Jesus of the New Testament, he would feel free to kind of borrow these motifs and be able to elicit kind of fear in the part of the Christian majority population that he lived in. And that, I think, also, as what Jefferson was doing, he would not see necessarily the Bible as being something sacred, as being written by God, because if he believes in a prime mover, the prime mover sets up the world and then kind of steps away. So he would simply see the Bible as an anthology of ancient writings and be able to extract components out of there to create sublime terror from a culturally conditioned reader. So in conclusion then, in reading these papers, is that I felt that reading Timmerman and Cook's paper provided a little more context for this structuralism kind of approach. I did think that there was a balance between Enlightenment and Romanticism, and perhaps what Timmerman says has some weight, but I think it really it feels better that it falls towards what Cook was saying, that Poe was more influenced by inquiry, in that he was trying to elicit emotions from the part of the reader. And so that was kind of in Poe's, as a craftsman of art, he was basically using the analytical thinking to kind of manipulate the emotions or the passions of his readers. And then finally, as I titled this presentation, Poe used these motifs and biblical allusions as a recipe book to create his literature, so that he could kind of maximize the emotion of sublime horror in his stories. And then finally, so that's kind of my main points. And then finally, these are the papers that I used to kind of understand the fall of the House of Usher. So that kind of concludes my presentation, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.